particularly with Facebook, one of the things that had come up is their sharing of information with Chinese companies. That are now like Huawei, who are basically maybe government run, and you have now the US government trying to extradite the leader of Huawei from Canada while she's visiting. So you've got this very interesting interplay between the criminal legal system. You have Congress trying to figure out what to do, and ultimately actually can come back to a constitutional issue, a First Amendment issue.
Podcast. I'm your host, Trent Lapinski. In this episode, I interview Vinoo Varghese. He is a criminal defense attorney and a former prosecutor. You may recognize him from CNN, CBS, and he was just on Wolf Blitzer. In this episode, we discuss the war on drugs, cannabis legalization, as well as big tech and data breaches. Plus, we dive into Julian Assange and the whole Chelsea Manning situation and what just happened with Assange's arrest and WikiLeaks. This is an amazing episode. We don't get a lawyer on the show that often, so please stay tuned.
Greetings, hacker. Ever wonder how to submit stories to Hacker Noon or check the status of your submissions? Well, wonder no more. Go to contribute.hackernoon.com. Whether you're a new writer, longtime contributor, or looking for the right place to spotlight your brand, get started with contribute.hackernoon.com. With your help, we are building Hacker Noon 2.0 to be the best place for tech professionals to publish, and it starts with a new submission flow. Head over to contribute.hackernoon.com today to claim your spot. You are Hacker Noon.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Vinoo. Tell us a bit about who you are and what you've been working on.
So Trent, I'm a criminal defense attorney, and I'm also a talking head. I'm on television regularly talking about criminal legal issues or all different types of legal issues, but mostly criminal stuff. I comment on CNN. I was actually on Wolf Blitzer's show last night at the time of recording it, which is now April 11th, right? So I was on yesterday. I comment for CBS, MSNBC, Headline News. I've been on Israeli TV, Turkish TV, Canadian TV. But that's my hobby. My day job is that I'm a criminal defense attorney. Most of our work is white collar work, financial fraud work. We're in federal courts all across the country. I have investigations right now in California, and not where you are in the Bay Area, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have a big investigation right there being prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office or investigated by the U.S. Attorney's Office that covers your neck of the woods.
And so, you're a former prosecutor, right?
Correct. I started out right out of law school. I was a state prosecutor in New York in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, and I prosecuted a bunch of all different types of stuff. But a lot of the work when you're a state prosecutor is drug work. So I was I did a lot of drug prosecutions. I've spoken a lot. I left the office in 2006. And I've been doing private criminal defense ever since then. And, I defend people who are charged with drug crimes. But initially I was an agent of the war on drugs. And now or for the last 15 years, I've been speaking out against it. And that's, one of the things where we met. I spoke to you about that.
So we met at the International Cannabis Business Conference here in San Francisco a couple months ago. And I really enjoyed your presentation. It was very interesting because you had a slide where you were talking about the classification of different drugs. And, we hear about these things in conversation and conversationally, but just to actually see and read the law, for me, it made no sense. I'm just seeing cannabis and herb, slapped in there with some pretty heavy duty drugs. And I'm just wait, one of these things is not the same. So can you talk a little bit about, that drug classification system and the war on drugs and how you ended up kind of on one end of the spectrum and now you're on the other?
So absolutely. One of the things that I brought in when I spoke at that presentation, we had a PowerPoint and I talked about the drug classification. Now the drug classification is set out by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. So I was pulling it up on my secondary screen. I'm gonna read to you what this means. So a Schedule 1 drug is something that's Schedule 1 are drugs, substances, or chemicals that are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Some examples, and this is right from the DEA website, which is a slide that I had up at the conference, are heroin, LSD, meth, they put in parentheses ecstasy, and peyote is actually on there. But the drug that should jump out at everyone is that marijuana, cannabis, is a Schedule 1 drug. So to put this in context, let's look at Schedule 2 drugs. Schedule 2 drugs, substances, or chemicals are defined as drugs with a high potential for abuse, with use potentially leading to severe psychological or physical dependence. These drugs are also considered dangerous. Some examples of Schedule 2 drugs are hydrocodone, Vicodin, cocaine, meth, methadone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, and they put in parentheses Oxycontin, fentanyl, Adderall, and Ritalin.
Yeah.
So what it jumps out is marijuana still to this day is a Schedule 1 drug, but considered with a high potential for abuse, with potentially leading to severe psychological, physical dependence. I'm reading Schedule 2. No currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse.
Mm-hmm.
That's what marijuana is classified as by the DEA.
Which I know you're not a doctor, but there's medical research on things like ecstasy, cannabis, even LSD for having therapeutic uses. I mean, they've talked about using MDMA for veterans who are dealing with PTSD. Cannabis, of course, has pain-relieving, anti-inflammatory properties. CBD, it isn't even psychoactive, which actually has been legalized due to the Trump administration. They actually passed it in a farm bill that that is now federally legalized. And was it rescheduled? Do you know what happened with CBD there?
On that, I'm not exactly sure.
Okay. I knew that was in the farm bill.
Yeah. I mean, what I can tell you is that there's been no. I think there are groups, like some of the groups that spoke at the conference we were at, trying to do something about this. But the reality is there doesn't seem to be there's nothing brewing right now in Congress to try to get marijuana off that Schedule 1. And what's happening is that, I see it, I've represented people charged with, marijuana importation and I had a client who was involved in money laundering with the Sinaloa cartel. Recently, I had covered the El Chapo trial for CBS, and I was regularly commenting at least once a week, sometimes twice a week, on the trial. And I spoke about that, having represented somebody involved with the cartel. Well, I'm really on more of a money laundering basis, but with those things. It's astounding to me that marijuana is considered by the DEA and Congress, for that matter, to be with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential of abuse, particularly when you have states, and we had put this little pamphlet together at the conference, and we did a 50-state thing to show where it's, the different level points of where marijuana is legalized. And so you have it, legal in adults and for medical use in a majority of states, and a number of other states, it's been decriminalized. Mm-hmm. Almost all the states are legal. The only two places where it's illegal are Idaho and South Dakota.
Yeah.
So completely illegal.
And I think some of those states are, and I know there's several states that have like pending laws that are going to go on the books soon, like in coming years. Right. They're planning medical or different classifications. I think Utah is one of them. I think they haven't done their medical system yet, but it's planned to go into effect at a certain point in the future. So, I mean,
one of the things, is that I forgot to mention, I'm in New York. I'm in my office, which you're looking at, is here on Wall Street, and this is the back of, that's my office. I'm at 2 Wall Street. And New York, new budget, Governor Cuomo, who had talked about potentially moving to legalizing, the new budget did not, or the new bills that he put forward did not call for the legalization of marijuana completely. It's not in the new budget, even though there was talk that it would be.
Greetings, hacker. Ever wonder how to submit stories to Hacker Noon or check the status of your submissions? Well, wonder no more. Go to contribute.hackernoon.com. Whether you're a new writer, longtime contributor, or looking for the right place to spotlight your brand, get started with contribute.hackernoon.com. With your help, we are building Hacker Noon 2.0 to be the best place for tech professionals to publish, and it starts with a new submission flow. Head over to contribute.hackernoon.com today to claim your spot. You are Hacker Noon.
But I understand CBD is actually still sold in New York, even though it's kind of a gray area right now.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. I think that, so there was a conflict recently, and this was highlighted by some of the local papers here, that there seems to be, like in New York City, both the Brooklyn and the Manhattan district attorney's offices basically said they're not going to prosecute simple possession cases of marijuana, but they are still prosecuting CBD possession cases. It's a little weird, and they haven't really figured this out yet. So,
yeah, I mean, the drug issue, I mean, it's so complicated because, as you were saying earlier, you know, when it comes to like some of these drug organizations, it's more about the money laundering and the potential crimes that take place because it's illegal, that actually causes probably more crime and more issues to take place. Whereas when you have a decriminalized system or a legalized system, you know, now you've got the regulatory frameworks in place so that it gets rid of the gray or black markets, so that the crimes that happen around those markets actually reduce or even completely go away.
I would think so, and then particularly with marijuana, I mean, the big issue in New York is, and they haven't figured this out yet, there's been a lot of discussions of you know, allowing companies to come in, right? California has done this for a while, and you know, you have all these companies and you have cannabis lawyers to assist these companies and setting them up and all that stuff. But in New York, there's been a debate, and they haven't figured it out yet, between, okay, you're opening up the markets to New York, you're going to have this available or open. Ultimately, it's going to happen. It's a question of when. And, you know, are you going to allow other, you know, companies to come in? And there's been talk that you have to, like the government wants to run this. And the reason is to give back to the communities that were devastated by the drug war. It's a nice idea in theory, right? It's like, okay, you know, it's the poor, you know, inner city communities that were devastated by the war on drugs. But, you know, I'm leery of government running things, and I think ultimately, having worked for the government, you know, my views are very skeptical of the government, and I just think that, you know, that's not going to work, and you have to allow for private companies to come in, and that's how, you know, you're going to further decriminalize the, you know, or reduce or hopefully eliminate the criminal element here.
And once New York figures this out, I mean, that's probably the largest metropolitan area in the country. So once New York has that kind of figured out, that could also be the potential framework that then helps federally figure this out. Because once New York goes, you know, kind of so does the rest of the country. That's typically how a lot of these situations play out. So it'll be interesting to see what New York's next move is, because we've kind of figured things out in California. Like, I wouldn't say legal cannabis went well. I mean, it's definitely regulated cannabis, and they're still figuring out the tax issues and the incentives, and there's still a gray market, and there's still some things that are happening that, you know, are going to take some time and some careful consideration, and they're going to have to adjust laws here and there. But for the most part, it's working. You know, there's, you know, it's not feeding that kind of prison industrial complex like it used to. You know, they're taking some people out of jail who have just drug offenses. You know, certain things are starting to take place now where, you know, we're starting to head in the right direction. So, you know, what's going to happen next in New York, I can't say, but I think once New York figures it out, hopefully that will also then provide a framework federally.
I hope so too. I mean, because the feds are really behind on this stuff, and they're behind most states. I mean, New York, on criminal issues is not very progressive, and there was just major criminal justice reform here and done in New York that's for greater accountability for prosecutors. I mean, the Prosecutors Association here in New York, the District Attorneys Association, has been a powerful lobbying force in state government and has prevented the implementation of a watchdog group on prosecutors. And Cuomo, to his credit, I'm not a big fan of his, but to his credit, was actually able to get that passed. And the DAs are going to be looking to challenge it. And it called for greater transparency, whereas states like California and most states have actually greater transparency in the release of information that the prosecutor has, right? Mm-hmm. So the criminal case versus the civil case, you have in a civil case, if you go to trial, you know what the other side has, and you've known it for a long time. And what's at stake in a civil case? Money, right? It's when you're looking at somebody going to jail potentially for the rest of their life in the federal system and in New York up until like a couple of weeks ago, right? The prosecutors can get to hide everything until the last minute. So there are some discovery rules, and some people will take ANCA as well. There's certain things that they're required to turn over. Yes, but when you're as a criminal defense attorney, you want to know like what the government has written down. You want to know witness reports, witness statements. And in both the federal system and in New York, until extremely recently, the prosecution can hide that stuff until the end.
Well, and you're fighting for people's freedom. This is not money here necessarily we're talking about. This is
correct.
Actual people's lives and, potentially preventing them from going to jail for a plant. So, it's a pretty serious issue. This is not the same as, some of these financial cases. Anyways, I would love to kind of pivot the conversation to the tech industry since, this is the Hacker Noon podcast. So I'd love to get your thoughts on some of the stuff we've seen. You've had a lot of people in the tech industry, the CEOs of major tech companies, Twitter, Facebook, go in front of Congress recently. We've had so many data breaches. I've lost track of them. Do you have any thoughts on what's kind of happening in Silicon Valley and the tech industry in general?
Well, two different things, right? I mean, with the, data breaches are, one issue. That's obviously internal security, right? So the issue with these people going in front of Congress is actually really interesting. Over the last, 6 months, you've had Zuckerberg testify. You've had people from Twitter. So the interesting thing is when they had these hearings in the fall, last fall, Google didn't show up, right? and then they later showed up. Yeah. They're talking about what they can do to prevent, earlier in the summer with Mark Zuckerberg, preventing the dissemination of fake news and what they're going to do. And it seems like Facebook is having a really tough time. They're trying, but they're a really tough time to crack down on these fake news sources. And as we learned from even before the Mueller report, intelligence agencies have confirmed that there was, Russian, controlled troll farms that affected and put out fake news during the 2016 election. So
there was Cambridge Analytica and that whole scandal as well. So Facebook actually sold some of the data that resulted in some of this, which is even more crazy. And you've got, Facebook, and then Facebook did change their algorithm. So I did a whole episode on this with Christina Warren. She worked for Mashable and Gizmodo, and she now is at Microsoft. But we did a whole episode for an hour talking about the journalism apocalypse because Facebook turned off all news. That was their solution. They just turned it all off. So that has led to like massive layoffs at BuzzFeed and a lot of these major online publications because Facebook is no longer disseminating any news articles from any news organization because they couldn't figure out how to pick the bad ones from the good ones. So they just kind of turned them all off. So that literally affected the bottom line of some of these companies.
Yeah. And particularly with them, one of the things that had come up is their sharing of information with Chinese companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Companies that are now like Huawei, who are basically maybe government run and or are government run involved in, and you have now the U.S. government trying to extradite the leader of Huawei from Canada while she's visiting, and so you've got this very interesting interplay between the criminal legal system, and you have the Congress trying to figure out what to do, and ultimately this actually can come back to a constitutional issue, of a First Amendment issue, right? I mean, to the extent that Facebook and Facebook is not a government actor, right? And Google is not a government actor. They don't work for the government. They're not an arm of the government. So the question is, how much can Congress really regulate them to crack down on fake news and things like that? And to the extent, how much is this a suppression of free speech? So it's a really tough line and balancing act that both the government, the United States government, Congress, whatever, it has to have with these companies that, what are you doing? Are they okay? There's obviously a public interest in protecting against fraud, right? But at the same time, how much of that is, are you trampling on First Amendment rights?
Yep. No, absolutely. And the crazy thing is there is actually, I don't know what other word to use, collusion between the government and these companies. I mean, Amazon had I think $500 million contract with the CIA to be able to do data processing for the Central Intelligence Agency. So you've got government contracts between Google and the U.S. government, military industrial contracts. You've got a lot of contracts between these companies, and there is data and computing power being shared between the U.S. government and these tech companies. So although they are not government actors, in some cases they are when they are being contracted by the U.S. government. And that just opens a whole other, a whole other basket of legal issues, because, they're acting both as private companies, but also taking government contracts, and we don't know what's happening with the data. We don't know what's happening with a lot of these situations. And then that data keeps getting leaked, and we keep having these data breaches.
Yeah. One of the companies actually that you have to give a lot of credit to is Microsoft, which they actually went to the Supreme Court to try to block a search warrant of their servers, which were located in Ireland. And ultimately then they were fighting the U.S. government. And I was actually very impressed, that they were taking this position that ended up being a very technical position. Then Congress amended the law and it made the argument moot. And so there was a change in the law that basically, it's really in the weeds here, but ultimately, let me do this. The light just went out. So let me
go ahead.
Turn that back on. How is the lighting on my end, by the way? It's because
great until the lights turned off. Yeah. But so you're talking Microsoft. So maybe restate your Microsoft statement there.
Sure. So Microsoft had gone and to war with the U.S. government over the government had sought in a criminal case in New York to compel Microsoft to turn over server information, email data but their servers were located in Ireland. The question was, could the U.S. government compel an American company who puts the servers abroad to do that? And they said no under the old law. But then while the appeal was pending before the U.S. Supreme Court, Congress changed the law, and ultimately the issue became moot. So, but compared to other companies such as Google, which, as you were saying, you mentioned Amazon, but Google and other companies, I mean, it almost seems that there's no difference between the United States government and Google. Right? Yeah. And whereas a company like Microsoft was taking a stronger position, Apple, also took a position when it didn't release data on how to hack its iPhone. And that caused some controversy because that involved a terrorist attack in California. But I think they took the right position, but they were criticized by people who were uber pro law enforcement. And people that are uber pro law enforcement don't understand that you're really whittling away on individual protections, and that's what our country was founded on, right? Protections of the individual. And you have to applaud when an Apple or a Microsoft takes a stand like they do.
And as a lawyer, do you have a concern with the law's ability to stay up to date with like modern technology and what's happening? Because I interview a lot of people in the blockchain space, smart contracts. Like as a consultant, I have another project where I'm building an automation platform. We're at a point now where there's artificial intelligence, there's smart contracting, there's blockchains handling financial transactions outside the banking sector. There's so much happening right now on the technological front, and it's just going faster and faster and faster. Can the legal system and the judiciary system keep up?
This has been a constant struggle in the law, because the law usually takes a long time to catch up to this stuff. So a lot of the advancement of the law is actually happening on the commercial level where there's suits, right? But in terms of this is an issue right now in technology with GPS tracking and things along those lines that the courts have struggled with, and trying to put together a Fourth Amendment analysis, which is the right to be free from an unlawful search and seizure, has proven difficult, right? So if prosecutors have their way, everyone, you, me, everyone, all their information would be available to the government at a whim, right? And so it's these prosecuting agencies, and people always they look at prosecutors as the good guys, right? It's that law and order stuff really has seeped into pop culture, that these guys they're doing God's work, right? And these are the people, and it's funny, people ask me, let me take a personal level, they ask me what do you like more, being a criminal defense attorney or a prosecutor? I was like, serious? You're really asking me these questions? I tell people, you couldn't pay me all the money in the world to be a prosecutor again, because knowing what I knew, seeing what I've seen, it's just the amount of people that, often prosecutors, they get drunk with power, right? Mm-hmm. So why do people if you're a prosecutor, you're not getting, it's not a high paying job. It's decent paying when you're there for a while, right? But it's power, right? Power is the greatest, aphrodisiac, the greatest stimulant for a lot of these people. And that's why they become prosecutors. And there are, look, I don't want to say all prosecutors. I know a lot of good ones. I was a good one. And it's, I think a lot of people who take their job seriously and want to administer justice fairly. But then there's a lot of people who were take these positions of, we're not going to do anything. Well, what will we do with that data, right? It would just, if you're not a criminal, you've got nothing to worry about. I'm sorry, I don't want to leave that for you to judge.
Yeah, personally, personally, I think we almost need another Bill of Rights to protect privacy and data that puts privacy and data online, because we're almost dealing with two worlds here. We've got the real world and we've got the digital world. In the real world, we've got a constitution and we have laws and we have all these rights. But in the digital world, we have nothing. We're relying on case law as it comes. There's no there's nothing that says hey, I've got a right to privacy online. You can argue the real world laws affect the online world, but it's difficult and complex because they're really two different realms. They're almost two different dimensions. It's a very unique time in human history to have this dilemma that's taking place.
And there has been some movement, though. I will tell you that over the last couple of years, there's been very positive decisions that have come out of the U.S. Supreme Court, a conservative court with conservative justices like John Roberts ruling in favor of greater privacy. and that you need a warrant before you can put a GPS tracker under somebody's car, right? And that U.S. Supreme Court said that. So, you wouldn't have expected. So there is movement, and it's actually interesting. It's the people that are more libertarian that understand these things, and often libertarians are not necessarily Republicans, or Republicans are not necessarily libertarians. But there seems to be more people that are sort of in the sort of true conservatives. I'm not talking today's conservatives, right? In the current political climate.
It's about liberty.
Who are skeptical of government intervention. Justice Gorsuch has been, before he was elevated to the U.S. Supreme Court bench, has given talks about, the power of the prosecutor, and that in our society it's important to keep prosecutors in check. I was like, wow, music to my ears, and people don't appreciate that enough. And so I think the law is catching up, because believe it or not, I think the analysis, as long as you stick to our Constitution, stick to our Bill of Rights, and you put that in that context, it's just that it's going to take a while, right? Because all these issues, and as data develops, the issue that, there are prosecutors take the position, well, you signed away. You consented by using a cell phone. You've consented to monitoring, right? Yeah. There are prosecutors who take that position.
I know. It's kind of crazy. We live in trying times. I'd love to ask you a little bit about something that actually just happened today just before we were recording this, is Julian Assange got arrested. And then we also had Chelsea Manning arrested again for refusing to testify against Assange, potentially knowing that Assange was potentially going to be handed over to the UK authorities. What are your thoughts? Is Julian Assange going to get extradited to the US? Is this going to go to court? What's about to happen here?
So if I can, Trent, can I share my screen with you?
Good. Or if you want to just read it, maybe.
Yeah, I was going to show. I pulled the indictment that was released, and it looks, and the reason. So your question of is he going to get extradited? The answer is going to be yes. Right? Is the British government is certainly going to give him to the United States government. It's just it's going to happen. They wouldn't have unsealed this indictment, if that weren't going to happen. Because there has to be a formal indictment in order for the State Department to make the extradition request and file that with the government of the in the United Kingdom.
And so, they showed their hand by going after Chelsea Manning and trying to get her to testify against Assange. Why do that if you're not going to be prosecuting Assange?
You're right, and here's so the same. So she's being held for civil contempt, right? So because she's already been found guilty, right? She was found guilty, and her sentence was commuted by President Obama, right? That was one of his last acts. But so she has no Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination because she can't incriminate herself. By refusing to testify, she's being held in civil contempt for not cooperating with the investigation, because she can't plead the Fifth.
Yeah.
There's no Fifth for her. She's already been found guilty. So
that's crazy. So back to Assange, what is there a legal precedent here for, I mean, personally, I make the argument that he's a journalist. I mean, did he take, potentially leaked and or stolen files? Yes. I mean, I think we've concluded due to the Mueller report that the Russian collusion narrative is kind of not what we thought it was. And it's now potentially likely that, WikiLeaks may have gotten the DNC files that during the 2016 election from an inside source. I personally reviewed the data on how that, what went down there. There is evidence that it was a thumb drive that was plugged into a DNC computer, and that was the source of the leak. And it wasn't a traditional hack in the sense that, someone who was remotely outside the network got access to the network. It was more likely that someone physically had access to it. So we obviously don't know. This is speculation, what the details are there. But, is there a legal precedent for, a journalist or a journalism organization to release leaked files? And, will he have the same protections as a journalist, or is he considered not a journalist?
So the interesting thing, I'm looking at the indictment, and before I get to that question, I want to address something you just said about the Mueller report. Let's be clear here, and people are jumping at this. Mueller report still hasn't been released to Congress, right? There's been a summary put forth by the Attorney General, who, at the time of our filming of this, as the previous 2 days had testified before Congress. And Bob Mueller, the prosecutor, did not find evidence sufficient to warrant prosecution. The idea of collusion of individuals of the Trump campaign colluding with the Russian government, right? That just means that there wasn't enough proof from his perspective to bring a case. The obstruction charges, as he said, he was not exonerated.
Yeah.
G. Barr made the decision to exonerate him. So this is long, far from over, and it's going to be developed. And the narrative may not be anywhere near what President Trump has said in terms of total incarceration once this gets to Congress. Now, getting back to Assange in terms of precedent and all this other stuff, I'm going to read you what it says here in the indictment. And this is out of the Eastern District of Virginia, which is considered one of the top prosecutorial, which is Northern Virginia. It's one of the top prosecutors' offices in the country. It's where Paul Manafort was recently prosecuted. Paragraph 5 of the indictment says, Assange, when it talked about him being the founder and leader of the WikiLeaks website, publicly solicited submissions of classified, censored, and other restricted information. Assange, who did not possess a security clearance or need to know, was not authorized to receive classified information of the United States. So the charge is conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. That's what they've charged him with. And this is just an initial charging document. I imagine there's going to be more charges against him. They're going to supersede this this indictment against him, or and they'll add more charges depending on when he gets over. Yeah. So there's stuff about here in this about Manning and Assange discuss the value of Guantanamo Bay detainee assessment briefs. Before entering the password cracking agreement, and there's a lot of stuff in here.
Well, there's two issues, because there's the Chelsea Manning situation, right? So there's the information that Chelsea gave to WikiLeaks that basically revealed a lot of information about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and that revealed a bunch of cables and a bunch of private and classified communications and all kinds of classified information about wars that were taking place. So that's one issue. Then the second, more recent issue was what happened during the 2016 election with John Podesta's emails, the DNC emails. And that probably had a direct impact on the 2016 election and potentially did help Trump get elected, because a lot of that content from those leaks, it made a pretty unique, it painted a very unique picture of the inside of a political campaign that we've never had insight to before. So I personally read through a lot of the files because I got to look inside a presidential campaign. Like, that's a window that I wanted to peep into. You will probably never get to see what that looks like before. We've never seen what that looks like before, and we'll probably never get to see something like this again in U.S. political history.
Right.
So it was fascinating because it did talk about a lot of different things. Potentially the Bernie Sanders issue of was he the real nominee? Did Hillary Clinton sway the Democrats and superdelegates and manipulate that system? Like, there's some real controversy here. There were some real things that were revealed that probably had an impact on the way that some people voted. So that's the second most recent issue. But I think probably a lot of the charges that are going to be brought against Assange are going to be for the Chelsea Manning issue and the first issue, which was, the leaking of classified information regarding wars in, Iraq and Afghanistan.
So right now, as of the moment that we're filming this on April 11th, 2019, the only thing that's been released to the public is that computer hacking conspiracy with Chelsea Manning. So it does not appear as of yet there are charges related to their 2016 election against Julian Assange. Now, that could change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Once he's brought over.
And I wonder if there is some connection to all of this and the Mueller report, because there could be, since we haven't been able to read it, at least at the time of when this is being recorded. So, like I said, the fact that Chelsea Manning was arrested and, they were trying to get her to testify, a month or so ago, tells us that they were, the prosecutors were potentially knew that they were going to be prosecuting Assange at some point in the near future. So it sounds like this has all been in motion for a while.
Yeah, and I'll tell you this about the Mueller report. You're not going to know the answer to that question because that's, if it's an ongoing investigation, that is definitely not getting to Congress.
Yeah, and I could definitely see that as well. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here so far. We're on the Hacker Noon podcast, so I've got to ask you, sometime in your life that you've had to hack something.
Well, I had to hack the New York District Attorney's Office. No, I didn't hack into their system as in a traditional definition of hack, but I had a situation back in 2013 where I was defending a client, and it was a press case. And there was a lot of press about this case. And ultimately, the DA's office took a position where they wanted to get me off this case. And it was actually the biggest compliment that they could have paid me. But what they did was manufacture a conflict between my client and me, because they called me to testify. They sent me a grand jury subpoena to testify against a witness who had provided information to the district attorney's office against my client. And so you just follow along here. This gets a little complicated, but so there's no privilege between me and that witness. Ultimately, that witness who testified for the DA was providing helpful information to us. And so the question was at the time is they called me and they were like, "Oh, we'd like to talk to you about your conversations with Marina," right? And I said, "Well, I'm not confirming nor denying whether I had any conversations with Marina." "Well, would you accept a grand jury subpoena by email?" I said, "You can serve me any way you like. Service isn't going to be the issue. I'll save you the trip of having one of your detectives come over to my office and hand it to me." And I accepted it by subpoena. And then I was like, these people are crazy, because ultimately, in terms of, I have an investigation to conduct on my own to protect my client. How, who I speak to is none of their business. Imagine that, me asking them, "Hey, tell me who all the witnesses are right now." And we're not at trial. It's a different thing when you're at trial, right? When you have to reveal that, you got to give witness lists, but investigations are secret. Right? So how I conducted my investigation was none of their business. So they wanted to know about conversations I had with this witness. Well, I could neither confirm nor deny. And ultimately what we did was it was such a unique situation. I went to the newspapers, and the New York Law Journal started covering it. And they put me on the front cover of the New York Law Journal like 5 times. And ultimately it became this issue of really infringing upon my client's rights to have me represent him. And so the National Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys, which is a nonprofit national group that does a lot of policy work, came in and represented me pro bono, because they found the subpoena to be such an infringement, such a deliberate interference into my relationship with my client. Because ultimately, had I testified and provided information about my conversations with this witness, while not the subject of what I discussed with my own client, this would have adversely affected my client. Yeah, because I'm conducting an investigation, or at least that's what they thought, right? And what was said between a witness and I ultimately would have been negative for my client, and ultimately would have required me to get off the case. So because I could no longer represent him, and that's what they intended. And so the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and then the Legal Aid Society here in New York came in as what we called an amicus in support of this, and they moved to quash the subpoena. And ultimately, the DA withdrew it because they looked really bad.
Yeah. So ultimately, you use the media in a way to kind of hack that situation, to bring light to the situation, to kind of rally reinforcements.
If it weren't for that, then, it would have been a lot harder. And I think that this could have been litigated more. That the media and having a group like the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers that is really committed to protecting, the right to counsel and an individual's right to have the lawyer of his choice.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from drug laws to data breaches to tech industry being called in front of Congress to Julian Assange. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I would just say in any situation, and I'm the biggest cheerleader, question the government, question the actions. Don't take things at face value, because there's a lot of assumptions. Don't assume if somebody has been arrested that they're automatically guilty, no matter what kind of charge it is. I mean, I'm being American, right?
Yeah.
Criticizing is being American, and that's what makes this country great.
Absolutely. Well, where can people find you? So
you can find me online at vargheselaw.com. That's VARGHESELAW.com. Just Google me. I'm kind of all over the place. It's you're
on CNN, CBS, name any of the major mainstream media news sources.
I'm there. I've been on all of them, and I'm on them regularly. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on the show and talking about all these topics. This has been an amazing episode.
My pleasure, Trent. Thanks a lot.
This concludes another episode of the Hacker Noon podcast. I'm your host, Trent Lapinski. Please don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes and YouTube, and follow us on social media. You can also find us at hackernoon.com and podcast.hackernoon.com for more episodes. Thank you for listening.